In a quiet seaside town where fog rolled in like a soft secret and the days felt half asleep, there was a small photography studio tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. Its window displayed portraits so vivid that people swore the subject seemed ready to breathe again, eyes bright with a life not yet lived. Above the door, in faded gold letters, was the sign. Moments in Time, by Adrian Cross. No one knew much about the photographer who owned it. He rarely spoke, rarely left his shop, and always worked at twilight, when the world hovered delicately between what was and what might be. Those who had their photographs taken there said something strange always happened afterward. Their portraits seemed to change. A child's smile that had once been shy would, days later, look radiant and brave. An old man's weary face would soften, as if he'd finally forgiven himself. And one woman swore that, in the photograph Adrian gave her, she saw herself standing beside a stranger she hadn't met yet, someone she would one day love. No one ever understood how it worked. Adrian just smiled and said, "I don't capture who you are. I capture who you're becoming." One gray afternoon, a young journalist named Clara Hale arrived at the studio. She had come to write a story about him, though she didn't truly believe the rumors. She'd lost her faith in magic years ago, traded wonder for deadlines and cynicism. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The studio smelled faintly of salt and old film. On the walls hung photographs that seemed to shimmer with something more than light. Behind the counter stood Adrian, tall, thin, his hair silvering at the temples. His camera hung around his neck like an old friend. "You've come for a portrait?" he asked. "I've come for the truth," she replied. "They say your photographs show the future." Adrian smiled faintly. "The future doesn't like to be photographed, Miss Hale. But sometimes, it lets me borrow a glimpse." She raised an eyebrow. "And how does that work?" He tapped his chest lightly. "Every face carries the echo of what's to come. You just have to listen before you press the shutter." Despite her skepticism, Clara agreed to sit for a portrait. Adrian guided her to a worn leather chair by the window. The fading light touched her face like a whisper. "Don't smile," he said softly. "Just think of something you still hope for, even if you've forgotten how to admit it." She wanted to laugh, but something in his voice stopped her. So she did as he asked. She thought of her mother, the way she had sung to her as a child before illness took her voice, the way Clara had promised to keep dreaming for the both of them and then, somehow, stopped. Adrian's camera clicked. Once. The sound was quiet, almost reverent. He handed her the photograph a few minutes later. It was black and white, the edges still warm from the printer. Clara looked down, and froze. It was her. But not her now. The woman in the picture was older, standing in a sunlit field, smiling, not a posed smile, but one that came from somewhere deep and healed. In her hand she held a camera, the same kind Adrian used. Clara's throat tightened. "This isn't real." Adrian's eyes were kind but firm. "It could be. Futures are possibilities, not promises." Over the next few days, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. It felt alive somehow, as though it were waiting for her to understand something. She returned to the studio under the guise of research, but the truth was she needed to see him again. The shop was empty except for Adrian, cleaning the lenses of his camera. "You're not the first to come back," he said before she could speak. "The hardest part of seeing the future is wondering whether you deserve it." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Adrian set the camera down gently. "Most people are afraid, not of what the future shows, but of what it asks them to become." He turned a photograph toward her, a picture of an old sailor smiling at the sea. "He came here 20 years ago, broken. I showed him this photo. Said it was impossible. But last year, he sent me a postcard, from the same pier in that picture." Clara stared at the image. "So your photographs make people change?" "No," Adrian said quietly. "They remind them they still can. As word of her article spread, more people began visiting the studio. Each left with a photograph that seemed to whisper something different, a promise, a warning, a hope. But not everyone was ready for what they saw. One man returned, trembling, demanding a refund. "You showed me a picture of my wife," he said, "but she's gone." Adrian looked at him sadly. "Gone where?" "She left last year." Adrian's gaze was steady. "Then perhaps the photo wasn't about the past or the present. Perhaps it's about forgiveness." The man didn't understand then, but months later, a letter arrived for Adrian. It was from the same man, saying he'd reached out to his wife, and that she'd answered. Clara read the letter as Adrian tucked it into a drawer filled with dozens just like it. "You keep them all?" she asked. He nodded. "Proof that time isn't a straight line. It's a circle that keeps offering us chances." One evening, Clara returned to the studio to find Adrian sitting in the dark, his camera on the table beside him. A single photograph lay in front of him, a self-portrait. It showed him standing by the window, the light behind him fading. His face was peaceful, but there was something final in it, as though he'd taken the picture knowing it would be his last. Clara's chest tightened. "When was this taken?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Tomorrow, I think." "You mean?" He raised a hand gently. "Don't be sad. Every photographer eventually steps out of the frame." She blinked back tears. "Then why show me all this? Why give people hope if you knew your own time was ending?" Adrian's voice softened. "Because hope is the only photograph that never fades." The next morning, the shop was closed. The window display was empty, the golden letters above the door faintly glimmering in the sunlight. No one ever saw Adrian Cross again. But on the counter sat his camera, and beside it, an envelope addressed to Clara Hale. Inside was a single photograph. It showed her, standing in front of the same studio, her hands holding a camera, her face lit by the same golden light. Below it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Keep taking pictures of tomorrow." Years later, people still talked about the strange photographer whose portraits showed futures instead of pasts. But now, the studio belonged to someone new. A woman with gentle eyes and an old camera welcomed visitors with the same quiet warmth. She listened carefully before pressing the shutter, always waiting for that heartbeat of truth. Above the door, the sign had changed. It now read, "Tomorrow's Light, by Clara Hale." And when people asked her how she captured such hope in her photographs, she always smiled and said, "I don't take pictures of who you are. I take pictures of who you still have time to be." The photographer who captured people's futures, a soft breeze tale about fate, fear, and the courage to see the life still waiting to be lived.